Yes.
So, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to Sans Films. For those of you who've never been here before, and there's a few of you, just explain that Sans Films is not a theatrical venue, although it looks like one. It's actually a workplace. It's a film studio. All this is fake. It's all illusion. It's all scenery. It's all built. It's not original. I think we built it, and we use this space for filming, for recording, for doing interviews, and all sorts of current affair films, what have you. And now we even got technology to do live broadcasts through broadbands and Anyway. But this event, this last event, is the last event of a series of events which Deborah has organised and which we felt very committed to, which is in remembrance, if you like, in the memory of Clement Attlee. There's plenty in the film world, where we work. There's plenty of stuff about Winston Churchill. Recently, there's 2 films about Winston Churchill. There's even another film. There's a big multi-million pounds drama which is making out that is all the heroism of this major cock-up that happened in Dunkirk, it was a major military cock-up, and it's presented to us now as an act of heroism, which is a slight twisting of the things. It's something to be very sad about, not something to be proud of, even if people individually were heroic. The point is that for those of you who made the donation, there was a face of Winston Churchill on it, on the £10, which you gave £10. I assume you must have done. Anyway, the point is that there is no face of Clement Attlee. I know he was a very modest man, but the sad thing is that today is the 50th anniversary of his death. The employees here, I've had 2 employees in their 30s. When I said we were doing a Clement Attlee weekend, they said, who's Attlee? Those are British people who are born here and who don't know who Clement Attlee is. Clement Attlee is responsible with all his faults and all the good and all the bad, everything. He's nevertheless the leader. First of all, he was a prime minister. He was the leader of the Labour Party, and he's one of the people who was instrumental to a major change to Britain, which is not only just a change which made things nicer, it's also a change by which most of Britain identify itself with. What they've created, what the team of people created in 1945, helped shape the Britain that we know now. And that is a great shame that he's not remembered more, better understood, especially in the fact that they worked in the context of a major crisis, and they in a way used this crisis to shape a better world. We are also going through a major crisis, and it so happened that maybe there is the opportunity for another leader of the Labour Party to shape a better world. It's our choice ultimately. It's what we will do out of it. It's not the individual who do it. It's the people who are involved who do it. So in that sense, we have almost a duty to remember, to study, to understand what they did, to see whether that can inform us into what we may have the opportunity to do. Anyway, I'm talking too much. It's over to Deborah, who's responsible for you being here tonight.
And he said everything I could possibly
No,
say.
You say it again. You cannot repeat it too much.
Well, we're coming. This is our closing event. It would have been an absolutely fantastic weekend. As Olivia says, today is the 50th anniversary of the death of Clement Attlee. It is also, as Adjoa said, it's the
50th anniversary of the death of Che Guevara.
Oh, it's a nice bookend. I am absolutely over the moon to have such a fabulous cast of performers. For tonight, we're calling it, in Clem's own words, to bring Attlee to life. Because this partly all started with me realising I was shamefully, woefully ignorant about the life of a man who my own personal, has absolutely affected my life. I don't think I would be where I am now had we not had that whole policy of council housing, public schooling, the whole thing. And we've been sharing this fact. In 2004, 139 historians and political scientists were polled by Leeds University in Moray, and they put Attlee as the 20th century's most successful Prime Minister for this country, above Churchill, above Thatcher. We just want to spread more of this knowledge because we think it absolutely reflects on now and where we are now. So, we're going to bring Attlee to life tonight. Francis Beckett, who's the author of the book from which all these words are taken. It's a fabulous biography called Clement Attlee, Labour's Great Reformer. We have brilliant Adjoa Andoh. I could read all night biographies, I'm not going to. Adjoa, Richard Attlee, who is one of Clement Attlee's grandsons, actor, Kika Markham, and Jeremy Hardy. And Francis will kick off with the narration. Enjoy. Thank you, everybody.
The teeming fetid mess of buildings and misery in the East End of London at the turn of the century, when thousands of men, women and children were herded together like ill-treated animals in their own filth at the end of Queen Victoria's long reign, was described in a pamphlet called The Bitter Cry of Outcast London. Published in 1883, it was written by the Reverend Andrew Mearns of the Evangelical Church. He wrote, "While we have been building our churches and solacing ourselves with our religion, and dreaming that the millennium was coming, the poor have been growing poorer, the wretched more miserable, the immoral more corrupt." He concluded, as Clement Attlee concluded 3 decades later, after working in the same part of the East End as Mr. Mearns, that, quote, "Without state interference, nothing effectual can be accomplished upon any large scale." A few short miles west of the East End, and in another world, on the 5th of January 1883, the year the Reverend Mearns published his pamphlet, Mr. Henry Attlee, a respected London solicitor, rose at 7 a.m. and held family prayers in his large Putney home with the servants present at 7:30 a.m. He led his children into the breakfast room just before 8 a.m. and picked up his copy of the Times. Mr. Attlee followed the same routine every morning, but perhaps that morning he glanced first at the top left-hand corner of the front page before delving into his paper. If he did so, he was reassured. There it was in the birth column following the Times house style. On the 3rd Attlee, Westcott Putney, to the wife of Henry Attlee, a son. That was how England learned of the arrival of the man who 6 decades later was to lead the government which changed fundamentally the way his countrymen lived and did more than any other government has ever done to bring to an end the evils identified by Mr. Mearns. Attlee's mother, Ellen, was no stereotype Victorian mother. She was educated to a level which many Victorians would have considered inappropriate for a woman. While the Attlee girls were educated at home, the boys were sent to a small private school when they were 5, all except Clem, who was kept at home until he was 9, learning from his mother and his sister's governesses and roaming at will among his father's large collection of books. This may have been because his size worried his parents. Whatever the reason, it certainly meant that he got a better education than a private school would have offered. Languages and music from governesses and his well-educated mother, poetry from his father's books, it stuck. At the age of 70, he would create a precedent for a British socialist by addressing the Socialist International Conference in Milan in fluent Italian. And he was still translating Italian Renaissance literature for fun. In 1896, he was sent to one of those dreadful institutions used by the English upper classes to beat their sons into men fit to govern an empire. Henry Attlee chose Haileybury in Hertfordshire. His elder brother Tom was already at Haileybury, hating it. Going back each term away from his comfortable and loving home was a torment to him. But unlike Tom, Clem made himself at home easily and without apparent trauma, as he did everywhere he went throughout his life, whether it was the East End of London or the House of Lords. It was a gift he had. And as a result, he felt a lifelong happiness about and loyalty to any place in which he spent an appreciable part of his life. In 1901, he entered University College, Oxford, joining Tom, who was in his 3rd year at Corpus Christi College. He studied modern history, specialised in the Italian Renaissance. He said, "I left Oxford with an abiding love of the city and the university, and especially of my own college." He decided, in a rather desultory way, to study for the bar. He told his first biographer, Roy Jenkins, that he was not very keen on any career. "I rather thought of some profession in which a living could be made, while in my leisure time I could continue my reading in literature and history and learn more of art and antiquities." It was not until he retired that he felt able to confess that he did have a real ambition. It was not to be a lawyer, nor a politician. It was to be a poet.
1906 was the year Clement Attlee discovered poverty. In the year that Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman launched the first assault on the conditions the Reverend Mearns had described, Clement Attlee's life was set on the course which led him to mount the second assault 4 decades later. In the Attlee family's tradition of public service, he decided to volunteer at Haileybury House, a charitable institution established in the East End by Attlee's old public school. His brother Lawrence collected Clem from the offices of Druces and Attlee, and they walked together to Fenchurch Street Station and took a train. 10 minutes later, alighting at Stepney, they found themselves in a world which neither of them knew or understood. Limehouse, the heart of the slums. Clem, still in his silk hat and tailcoat, walked gingerly through the disgusting, unclean streets for 5 minutes and looked up at Haileybury House. The sight of the Haileybury school crest on the outside wall seemed incongruous in those streets, on a dingy hall from which echoed rough Cockney voices. Attlee's shyness was acute that night. He found it agonizing to talk to the boys, who to him were like creatures from another planet. Despite his misery, Attlee learned enough that evening to want to come again, and he discovered more on subsequent visits. Life expectancy in middle-class Hampstead was 50. In working-class Southwark, 36. In a healthy middle-class suburb, 96 of every 100 infants would survive their first year of life. In a bad slum district, 1 in 3 would die. Later, after the First World War, he described part of what was happening to him. Take the case of a boy from public school, knowing little or nothing of social and industrial matters, who decides, perhaps at the invitation of a friend or from loyalty to his old school that runs a mission, or to the instinct for service that exists in everyone, to assist in running a boys' club. At first, he will be shy. Then, on getting to know the club boys, he will find himself with a new outlook and shedding old prejudices. The rather noisy crowd of boys on bicycles with long quiffs of hair turned over the peaks of their caps, whom he always regarded as bounders, become human beings to him, and he appreciates their high spirits and overlooks what he would formerly have called vulgarity. He goes out to referee them at football and finds that the only available ground is 4 miles away, and he remembers that somewhere he has heard of an agitation for open spaces, while the question of getting there makes him consider transport problems, trains, rail and buses, and he may begin to inquire who is responsible for these services. He finds the boys get there so late that the moon is already getting up, and perhaps his centre forward, on whom he had been relying, cannot get there at all. He finds it is a case of overtime, and the demand for shorter hours of labour becomes a reality. He realises now the value of the 48-hour week. A little later, he will perhaps visit one of his boys who is sick and begin to see the housing problem from the inside. Perhaps the family cannot afford proper treatment for the boy, and he is forced to consider the provision now made for the sick. And further, the wages question begins to interest him after he has had a talk with the boy's father, who is in the building trade and gets only occasional work. Privately, he wrote years later, "Few had boots, and their clothes were just rags. Many a time I've washed their cold, sore feet in winter." He had come a long way from the laconic remark he made to Lawrence as they travelled back to Putney after their first visit. It was a good show, that. Might look in from time to time.
By October 1907, Attlee was a socialist. The transition from being a cynical young Tory had taken just 2 years from that first visit to Haileybury House. The next step was to join a socialist organisation. A few days later, they went to the Fabian Society meeting and heard Bernard Shaw, Sidney Webb and H.G. Wells, and a sterile dispute about the future of society between several hirsute men. Have we got to grow a beard to join this show? Clem asked his brother. On the East End, one day an East End wharfkeeper called Tommy Williams came to Haileybury House, burning with indignation about how the Charity Organisation Society had refused help to one of the Haileybury boys. In the course of his story, he said he was a socialist, and Attlee said quietly, "I am a socialist too." The next Wednesday, Tommy Williams took him to join the local branch of the Independent Labour Party. The ILP was just what he wanted. It had a clear tactical objective to get independent representation in Parliament for working men. It was to achieve this that the Scottish miner Keir Hardy and his colleagues had founded the ILP in the year of Attlee's birth. It rejected the idea that socialists should work through the Liberal Party, and when Attlee joined it had 887 branches, 22,000 members and 30 MPs. The years 1906 to 1908 seemed to be when Attlee wrote most poetry, all of it marking in one way or another the faith he had found. One poem was just called Socialism, and it came from his heart.
Surely some day we'll make an ending of all this wretched state of want and greed. Children shall reap, glad cries forth sending, in fields where we have sown the seed. All through the years, mankind ascending leaves the outworn and seeks a higher creed. In true fraternity, on love depending, society fulfills its highest need. Man cannot rest until mankind is freed. Oh, who are these that come with no sound of trump or drum, with the steadfast silent tramping of an army in the night? And what the standard red that is floating overhead? And what is the cause of their gathering to the fight? Oh, these are they that work in the pit's foul heavy murk, the men from shop and factory, the men from mill and field, dwellers in many lands, the men of horny hands, that dig and build and fashion, that the earth her fruit may yield. These are they that sow the seed that other folk may feed, that build the stately palaces wherein they may not dwell, the makers of all wealth, stolen from them by stealth, who make a heaven for others and live themselves in hell. Attlee was now politically committed. His progress so far would have seemed impossible to him just 2 years previously.
Small political organisations are good at spotting a willing workhorse with time and enthusiasm. Within a few weeks, they made him branch secretary. He was neither getting briefs nor looking seriously for them, and on the few occasions he applied for jobs, he was turned down, perhaps partly because, as he put it, socialist activities in those days were not looked on with favour. 4 evenings a week were spent at Haileybury House, and the 5th at the ILP branch, where 8 or 10 working men and their new middle-class recruit sat around a stove in a small, grimy East London church hall. Attlee joined the committee for Trafalgar House School, a very large school in a poor area near Stepney Green. The meals provided had to be supervised by volunteers. Attlee often supervised more than 400 children. He did it by organising prefects to assist him, a system he had learned when he was a public schoolboy at Haileybury. The children got to know him. He remembered all his life the barefoot little girl who came up to him in the street and said, "Where are you going, Mr. Attlee?" "I'm going home for tea," said Attlee. And the girl said, "I'm going home to see if there is any tea." For Attlee, it was not enough that poor people should benefit from the decency of benign liberal politicians like Campbell Bannerman. A Labour government would treat proper food, shelter and medicine as rights rather than gifts, which could be given and taken away. And if he was to play his part in bringing about a Labour government, there was something he had to learn to do. The ILP branch secretary was not there just to keep the minutes and organise the meetings. There was a much more forbidding duty involved, something so appalling that a couple of years later he could not have contemplated it.
Socialism was spread from street corners by men standing on soapboxes or chairs and haranguing passers-by. The branch secretary was expected to take his share of speaking at outdoor meetings. Attlee was terrified, but he said he would do it. a remarkable measure of how much he had changed since the days when he was too shy an undergraduate to contemplate speaking at the Oxford Union, and of how much confidence the affection and respect of his new comrades had given him. So, on a windy night in March 1908, under a gas lamp on Barn Street, a cold and cheerless East End street, with his coat flapping round him and his heart in his boots, he climbed on a chair and began to speak in front of 5 other branch members. He was glad that the light was dim and no one could see him blushing furiously. His voice, never his most impressive attribute, was only just audible above the wind and the hissing gas lamp, and the few passers-by quickened their pace a little. But then a dozen or so stopped and listened, and when he finished they asked questions and he answered, and when he climbed down he felt like a man who had slain a dragon. He never lost his shyness, it was with him until the day he died, but it never again crippled him. He never became a great orator and never enjoyed it much, but as the years passed, he became at any rate competent. The comradeship of those who had given him this confidence was now, and remained, the bedrock upon which his confidence rested. He treasured his occasional weekends in the countryside, but always wanted to return to Stepney, as he explained in a poem called Dissatisfied. When in the hustle, the roar and the bustle of London town, strange thoughts come thronging, old dreams and longing for sea and down. I hear the thunder of waves far under that burst in spray, long combers sweeping and ripples creeping across the bay. The sheep bells ringing, the wild birds singing, by field and fold, a note of quiet mid nature's riot of blue and gold. But my heart keeps sighing, my soul is crying for town again, for London city, its hate and pity, its joy and pain. But most beguiling, the faces smiling, of folk I know. The boys will greet me, and comrades meet me, so I must go.
In 1909, Attlee became secretary of Toynbee Hall in Whitechapel, which aimed to develop relationships between universities and the working classes. His colleagues found him too left-wing for their taste. In any case, he saw Stepney and Limehouse as his area, not Whitechapel. That year, in one of his earliest poems, he wrote of what he felt for Limehouse. In Limehouse, before the break of day, I hear the feet of many men who go upon their way, who wander through the city, the grey and cruel city, through streets that have no pity, the streets where men decay. In Limehouse, by night as well as day, I hear the feet of children that go to work or play, of children born to sorrow, the workers of tomorrow. How shall they work tomorrow, who get no bread today? In Limehouse, today and every day, I see the weary mothers who sweat their souls away, poor tired mothers trying to hush the feeble crying of little babies dying for want of bread today. In Limehouse, I'm dreaming of the day when evil times shall perish and be driven clean away, when father, child and mother shall live and love each other, and brother help his brother in happy work and play. There was not the slightest chance now that he was going to settle down to a civil service career. 4 years before, he had written a poem called The Civil Servant. No more the old street corner where the busy traffic plies, no more the dear old platform and the cause that never dies. I've got a government job now, propaganda isn't wise. No more I'll take the platform with my comrades tried and true and talk for 20 minutes to 3 men and a dog or 2. I've got a government job now, that sort of thing won't do. No more the old branch meeting where I learned and where I taught, the minutes correspondence and delegates report. I've got a government job now, my silence has been bought. I feel a sort of traitor, but who the stone can cast? The dread of unemployment and the workhouse at the last. I've got a government job now, and the job has got me fast. But when my time is ended and my pension safe in hand, though I be old and weary, I'll join again our band, and have just one job only, preach the gospel through our land.
1912 found Attlee lecturing at the LSE School of Sociology, with money raised by Bipps and Sidney Webb. The job was perfect for him. Quote, the salary was small, but sufficient for my wants, while the hours of work left me plenty of time for social work and also for socialist propaganda, for it was a fundamental rule of the school that no one could be restricted in venting his political opinions. In these years, Attlee became a figure in the ILP without consciously trying to do so. He took on all the humble, time-consuming tasks which have to be done and which ambitious politicians generally consider of a lesser mortals. He cut up loaves to feed dockers' children during the 1911 dock strike, stood at the bottom of Petticoat Lane with his brother Tom holding collection boxes during the Irish Transport and General Workers Union strike in 1913. He carried the Stepney ILP banner on demonstrations through central London. He went to court to plead mitigation when a half-starving boy was caught thieving. In 1909, he spoke at 53 indoor and outdoor public meetings. In 1910, 88. In 1911, 63, and in 1912, 70. And so it was that the declaration of war in August 1914 found him on holiday in Devon with Tom and Kathleen. The ILP had always declared that if war came, socialists should refuse to fight. And the Attlee brothers read that in faraway Westminster, Ramsay MacDonald had resigned the Labour leadership because he opposed the war and was succeeded by Arthur Henderson, who supported it. What were they to do themselves? Tom and Clement travelled a long way together. Now they chose diametrically opposite directions. Tom was certain at once that as a Christian and as a socialist, he must be a conscientious objector, making it clear from the start by joining the No Conscription Fellowship and the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Clem insisted in the army as soon as he could, 2 days after war was declared. After 5 weeks or so, he found himself in temporary command of a company of 7 officers and 250 men, most of them from Wigan, Warrington and Liverpool. Clem enjoyed army life and the company of his brother officers. "Charming fellow," said one, "just going to play bridge with them, but a damned democratic socialist tub-thumping rascal." Clem recalled with affection 2 colonels who used to say, "Let's have a good strafe tonight, have Attlee to dinner." They would then, he says, discuss socialism or some other controversial topic. He was told that his company had been chosen to hold the final lines when Gallipoli was evacuated, and it would be the last to embark on the ships. On 19th of December, Attlee led 205 men to the beach at 5:30 p.m. He disposed his men in trenches and installed himself in a dugout with a telephone. During the evening, 3 parties of men went to the beach and embarked silently and under the watchful eyes of Attlee's company. Captain Withers noted, Captain C.R. Attlee's party, after remaining in the Lullababa defensive until the evacuation was complete, then embarked his party on HMS Princess Irene. Attlee was the last but one soldier to leave Gallipoli.
April 1916 found Attlee camped by the Suez Canal preparing for a battle. The evening before they were due to attack, he prepared his men for an early start, then sat in the trench with his sergeant major who told him stories of the Boer War. Perhaps it was in the cold, quiet, half-dark, before he was due to charge at the enemy, that he wrote this poem. If this dawn usher in eternal night, if I should die before another day, I shall not leave a child behind to say, my father fought and died in freedom's fight. Nor has the power been granted me to write books that the minds of other men shall sway, keeping my name in memory alway, to unborn generations a delight. I leave not books or children, thought alone, sprung from my words in others' minds like seeds, fallen by the wayside on the road of life. What harvest shall be reaped where I have sown? Good full-eared wheat, or tares or barren weeds, beauty and love, or ugliness and strife. At 5 a.m, Captain Attlee came charging out of his trench at the head of his men, carrying a flag to warn the British to lift their fire to avoid hitting their own troops. Just as I got to the Turkish trench and was sticking my flag in the ground, a shrapnel got me from behind, lifting me up like a big kick. I found myself sitting opposite Private O'Neill. 2 lads came up and asked if I was hit. I said I did not know, but when I stood up I found that I was, and I could not move. He'd lost the use of his legs. It was almost certainly friendly fire that got him, but he never once mentioned this to anyone, as far as I can discover. And he even had a little joke for his ILP friends. It may interest the comrades to know, I was hit while carrying the red flag to victory. I had a large artillery flag of that hue and was just planting it on the parapet when strafed. I I pointed out to the CEO that I thought the colour was a delicate compliment to my political persuasions.
The retired Major Attlee, who limped back to Stepney in 1919, was changing too. He was, perhaps without appreciating it, less of a youthful political idealist and more of a professional politician than the soldier who had left 5 years earlier to go to war. 2 days after he was discharged, Attlee was sitting in a room above a chemist's shop owned by one Oscar Tobin, a man who would play a major role in Attlee's political career, not least in the new Stepney Labour Council appointment in November 1919 of Attlee as mayor. Attlee was proud of the council's record during his mayoral year. He was able at last to do something about the slum landlords, who charged exorbitant rents but refused to spend money on keeping their property in a habitable condition. The council served more than 40,000 legal notices on house owners to repair their property and made sure these orders were enforced. It set up advice bureaus to advise tenants of their rights. It appointed sanitary inspectors and health visitors, started antenatal clinics, and reduced the infant mortality rate. It created work for some of the unemployed ex-soldiers for whom the government refused to do anything. To pay for this, it raised the rates, and Attlee, who was chairman of the valuation committee, brought in professional valuers to look at many of the pubs which had never been properly valued. The result was an additional £200,000 on the council's income and the renewed hostility of conservative publicans.
While Mayor, Attlee, who had taught social workers at the LSE, was asked to edit a social service library series for publishers George Bell and Sons and to write the first book himself. The Social Worker is a workmanlike textbook for professional social workers, but it is also a clear statement of the principles which were to underlay the creation of the welfare state by the Attlee government a quarter of a century later. He never forgot the charitable clergyman who thought the porridge served to the poor should always be a little burned to put off those who were not in dire need. He thought that if a rich man wanted to help the poor, he should pay his taxes gladly, not dole out money at whim. In a civilized community, although it may be composed of self-reliant individuals, there will be some persons who will be unable at some period of their lives to look after themselves, and the question of what is to happen to them may be solved in three ways. They may be neglected, they may be cared for by the organised community as of right, or they may be left to the goodwill of the individuals in the community. The first way is intolerable, and as for the third, charity is only possible without loss of dignity between equals. A right established by law, such as that to an old age pension, is less galling than an allowance made by a rich man to a poor one, dependent on his view of the recipient's character and terminable at his caprice. He also quotes Bernard Shaw. Most of the money given by rich people in charity is made up of conscience money ransom, political bribery, and bids for titles. We often give to public objects money that we should devote to raising wages among our own employees. The mere disbursement of large sums of money must be counted as a distinctly suspicious circumstance in estimating persona character. So if you can't leave the poor to starve and die of treatable illnesses and live in squalor, and charity is not the answer, that leaves his third option. State welfare payments are not charity. The organised community has made provision for some of the eventualities of life and has given its citizens the right to avail themselves under certain conditions of these provisions. In charity there is no right. Whatever is provided is a gift. He's especially horrified by the fact that in those pre-NHS days, hospitals relied largely on charity. The whole business of collecting for hospitals by means of special days on which collectors stand at street corners and blackmail passers-by, or by which collections are made in factories, is thoroughly unworthy of the dignity of the service. Scarcely better is the system by which large sums are given by persons who hope to receive titles in exchange. There is no charity in the bulk of the giving to hospitals.
In the summer of 1921, Clem fell in love. He had arranged a holiday in Italy with a close friend of his brother Tom from his Oxford days called Edric Miller. Miller suggested that his mother and younger sister, whom Attlee had met, should accompany them, and Attlee agreed. "I do not know whether I shall surprise you," Clem wrote from Norway House on the 8th of October to his brother Rob and his sister Margaret, known in the family as Mig, "when I tell you that Violet Miller and I got engaged today. Although we had only met twice before the Italian tour, yet we have had, I think, better opportunity than most of getting to know each other. I can only half believe good fortune." They honeymooned in Dorset and then gave a reception in Limehouse Town Hall for Labour Party comrades. The East London Pioneer reported, Major Attlee, in replying in a brief and witty manner, said that in his marriage at a not very early age, he saw a happy simile for the Labour movement. The movement was waiting some time before it came into its own, but it would do so.
On the night of the 15th of November 1922, the 1917 club in London was packed to capacity to hear the election results, and they cheered and applauded as news of victories came in. The Limehouse result was not announced until the next day, but it was worth the wait. Attlee won by 9,688 votes to 7,789, a majority of 1,899, a considerable achievement, since the popular sitting Conservative had held the seat for 16 years. A horse and cart came to the town hall and carried him through the streets to the cheers of his constituents. He was one of 142 Labour MPs. There had been only 57 before the general election. At the December 1923 election, Attlee's majority, like his party's, continued its inexorable rise. The Conservatives remained the biggest single party in the House of Commons with 258 MPs, but no longer had an overall majority. In January 1924, Labour and the Liberals combined to bring down the Conservative government, and the King sent for Ramsay MacDonald. By 1929, Attlee was 47 years old and had been in Parliament for 7 years. He was a quietly respected MP on terms of mutual respect with the greatest in the land and considered solid. But it must have crossed his mind that absolutely nothing either he or his party had done in Parliament had begun to address the evils that brought him into politics. His Stepney constituents still lived dreadful lives, full of grinding poverty. At the same time, the methodical Attlee was working on a way to ensure that the next Labour government did not fail as the last two had failed. We are hard at work on defining policy, he wrote to Tom. My idea is a plan of action to be agreed on, so that when we win next time, we shall know exactly what to do, how to do it. This aligned him with the left, and he was establishing himself as the natural successor to the 72-year-old George Lansbury after 1931. The association with Lansbury gave him the aura of the idealistic left. His own industry in policy making and his laconic delivery gave him the gravitas. In December 1933, Lansbury fractured his thigh and was told he needed a complete rest. Attlee became acting leader for longer than expected, 9 months. And by the end, for the first time, the implausible idea that the modest major from Limehouse might one day be Prime Minister had started to dawn on his colleagues. Attlee had not forgotten what he learned in Limehouse before the war, telling the House of Commons in November 1933, I lived for many years in, and I represent now, a slum area where the houses are utterly worn out. The Minister of Health reminds me of a lady who came some years ago to our district, whose object was to help the poor by showing them how to make a baby's cradle out of an old banana crate. He rightly received some of the credit for preventing the government from lowering still further rates of unemployment pay. This concentration on the minutiae which makes poor men's lives bearable or unbearable might have looked parochial, but Attlee had also become an expert on India, and now he played a key part in drawing up and piloting through the House the Government of India Act of 1935, which devolved a good deal of power. It was a bitter defeat for the Conservative diehards, led by Winston Churchill, who spoke in the House of Commons about the nauseating and humiliating spectacle of this one-time inner temple lawyer, now seditious fakir Mahatma Gandhi, striding half-naked up the steps of the Viceroy's palace, there to negotiate and to parley on equal terms with a representative of the King Emperor. 2 years later, in 1935, we see Attlee standing for the leadership. There were 3 candidates, Attlee, Morrison and Greenwood. On the second ballot, nearly all Greenwood's votes transferred to Attlee. Attlee won by 88 votes to Morrison's 48 votes.
By 1937, international affairs were coming centre stage, and at the end of 1937, Attlee travelled to Spain to visit Loyalist territory and to take a message of encouragement to the government forces. They also went to the front line and carried out a torchlight inspection of the British battalion of the International Brigade, who had volunteered to fight for democracy in Spain and had been smuggled across the Pyrenees to avoid French and British blockades enforcing non-intervention. One of the companies was named in his honour, the Major Attlee Company. He returned with their letter. The people of Britain can force the national government to abandon its policy of help for Franco. All of us have read with great interest the splendid campaign being conducted in Britain by the Labour Party. Back in Britain, the MPs produced an 8-page pamphlet called We Saw in Spain. Attlee's own contribution, Spain Fights for Democracy, was written in his clipped lawyerish style with his usual quota of saving phrases. In my view, the policy of non-intervention is responsible to a great extent for the food difficulty. But real passion sometimes breaks through. Continued acquiescence in a one-sided non-intervention has made the British government an accessory to the attempt to murder democracy in Spain. It made Attlee something of a hero among the young and idealistic left. In Oxford, after he had spoken against non-intervention, he was carried in triumph, shoulder high, down the high street, with huge crowds watching. This produced a moment that is pure Attlee. He kept looking at his watch, then looking down at his youthful admirers and saying, "Please put me down. I shall miss the 9:34 to London."
In that same year, 1937, the newly elected Labour government in New Zealand prompted Attlee to write that it had shown the way for a Labour Party which knew what it wanted. In its first year, it had nationalised the banks, given generous old age pensions, decreed a 40-hour week, and taken over the export of dairy products, by far the nation's biggest industry. So there was no point in compromising on socialist principles. I find that the proposition often reduces itself to this, that if the Labour Party would drop its socialism and adopt a liberal platform, many liberals would be pleased to support it. I have heard it said more than once that if Labour would only drop its policy of nationalisation, everyone would be pleased and it would soon obtain a majority. I am convinced it would be fatal for the Labour Party. People who say socialism curtails individual liberty belong invariably to the class of people whose possession of property has given them liberty at the expense of the enslavement of others. A far greater restriction on liberty is imposed on the vast majority of the people of this country by poverty. The poor man cannot choose his domicile. He must be prepared at the shortest notice to remove himself elsewhere if economic circumstances demand it. How little would those who so easily recommend this to the workers appreciate being transferred from their pleasant homes in Surrey or Buckinghamshire to Whitechapel or the Black Country. There is no point in watering down Labour's socialist creed in order to attract new adherents who cannot accept the full socialist faith. On the contrary, I believe that it is only a clear and bold policy that will attract this support.
Most people in the Labour Party recognised the urgency of ending the policy of appeasement, but there was a sharp division on how to do it. The left, headed by Stafford Cripps, wanted to construct an alliance of all parties and individuals, including dissident Conservatives like Anthony Eden and Winston Churchill, against Chamberlain and appeasement. The United Front said its supporters would range from Churchill to Pollitt. Harry Pollitt was leader of the Communist Party. In January 1939, Cripps presented detailed proposals to Labour's National Executive. It turned them down and decreed that Labour Party members must not advocate them. Cripps, Aneurin Bevan and 5 others were expelled from the party for continuing to do so. The party conference in June confirmed the expulsions and rejected the United Front. The idea was dead. The United Front, Attlee argued, would ensure that socialism had no future. The desire for unity on the left has been a constant feature of liberalism. 30 years ago, socialists were accused of splitting the progressive vote. Amiable radicals have often put the plea to me, if only you would drop socialism and join us. It is assumed that the Labour Party cannot win a majority for its immediate programme. I do not accept this, although I admit that disruptive tactics and the preaching of defeatism has made that task more difficult. It is assumed that a majority can be obtained by Labour allying with liberals, communists and mugwumps on a non-socialist programme. I believed that any alliance with the communists would be electorally disastrous. In 1939, as in 1931, I replied to those who ask me to change my faith because times are difficult, that socialism is not a fancy fair-weather creed, but a faith.
Coming from Attlee, this is tantamount to being incandescent with rage. He allowed one of his poems to be published anonymously in the Daily Herald to the tune of the red flag. It went, "The people's flag is palest pink, it's not blood red but only ink. It's sponsored now by Douglas Cole, who plays each year a different role. Then raise our pallid standard high, wash out all trace of scarlet dye. Let Liberals join, and Tories too, and Socialists of every hue. With heads uncovered, swear we all to have no principles at all. If everyone will turn his coat, we'll get the British people's vote."
In March 1939, Hitler occupied what remained of Czechoslovakia, which he had undertaken not to do, and immediately began threatening Poland. The next month, Mussolini invaded Albania. Once again, Europe and the world was to be plunged into war. Churchill and Attlee had never worked together, but now these two very different men had to learn to do so very quickly. Only Attlee and Churchill were in the war cabinet from start to finish, and Attlee did the nuts and bolts work required to keep the government together. There was a constant need to reassure Labour people that Labour had not sold its soul, its principles and its future for a few seats in the war cabinet. There was a need to reassure Conservative backbenchers. Attlee was the administrator, the conciliator, the greaser of wheels, the reassuringly common-sense figure at the heart of government. And there were many times in the next 4 years when it was necessary for Mr. Attlee to have a word with the Prime Minister. He had an understanding of conscientious objectors from his brother Tom. He once intervened at his brother's request, and an internee was released. Right from the start, it was the case that, as a Churchill aide told Hugh Dalton, if Attlee digs his heels in, he will win. In February 1942, Churchill gave Attlee the title of Deputy Prime Minister. This, as Churchill wrote, was a change in form rather than in fact, as Attlee's simple, steadfast loyalty amid such strains was invaluable. Attlee also became Dominion's secretary, which brought him back once again to the problems of India.
Throughout this time, Attlee held steadfastly to one thing. He wanted the United Nations, a supranational authority with the will, the power, and the resources to contain international bandits like Hitler, a sort of international police force. The League of Nations failed, he said, but the idea was right. Individual nations must give up some of their sovereignty so that the UN could be effective. This had been near the top of his mind ever since 1933 and was to stay there for the rest of his life. In retirement, he became a keen advocate of world government. In power, he restlessly pursued a policy of getting nations to give up some of their autonomy to the UN. On the 1st of January 1933, he had tried out privately on Tom a revolutionary idea. I am being forced to the conclusion that nothing short of a world state will be really effective in preventing war. As long as you rely for security on a number of potential armaments, you will have the difficulty as to who shall bell the cat. I want us to come out boldly for a real long-range policy which will envisage the abolition of the individual sovereign state. If one could get an alliance of Britain, France, the USA and Russia, I think the smaller neutrals would all fall in, and the outlaws, Japan and Germany, would find that they could not compete and so come in too. The UN was to be the basis of a new world order based on democracy, and the British model of democracy is not the only one, he said.
At home, the key to the Labour minister's strategy was the Beveridge Report, published on the 1st of December 1942 and written by another of Attlee's old colleagues from the LSE, now a distinguished civil servant, William Beveridge. Beveridge turned what could have been a dry bureaucratic task into a 200,000-word government report which sold 100,000 copies within a month of publication and inspired a generation. It was the reason Attlee was a politician. The Beveridge Report was a detailed plan to slay what Beveridge called the 5 giants: want, disease, ignorance, squalor and idleness. To do this, he said, Britain needed a comprehensive welfare system based on 3 things: a free national health service, child allowances and full employment. Churchill welcomed the report but insisted there should be no attempt to implement it during the war, nor any guarantee that it would be implemented after the war, because it might not be affordable. Labour ministers were unable to shake this resolve. It was a question of putting up with it or leaving the government. Attlee decided to put up with it. This provoked the most serious parliamentary crisis of the war. Only 23 Labour members supported the government on the issue, and 22 of them were ministers. 119 voted against. The vote was not a one-off incident. It was a symbol of growing discontent in the Labour Party and further proof that Labour's leader was determined, so far as they were concerned, to be subservient to Churchill for as long as possible.
It was a view that he might have revised if he had seen the private letter Attlee wrote to the Prime Minister in January 1945 about the method, or rather lack of method, of dealing with matters requiring cabinet decisions. It must be the most ferocious personal attack on a Prime Minister that a member of his cabinet had ever written, and it speaks of months of desperation and frustration. There is no doubt at all that Attlee was a proxy for many ministers, Conservative as well as Labour, but only Attlee could or would do it. Churchill had set up several committees, Attlee said, in which overworked ministers made enormous efforts to reach an agreed decision. After a long and unnecessary delay, the proposals would reach the cabinet. He writes, "When they do come before the cabinet, it is very exceptional for you to have read them. More and more often you have not read even the note prepared for your guidance. Often half an hour and more wasted in explaining what could have been grasped by 2 or 3 minutes reading of the document. Not infrequently a phrase catches your eye which gives rise to a disposition on an interesting point only slightly connected with the subject matter. The result is long delay and unnecessarily long cabinets imposed on ministers who have already done a full day's work and who will have more to deal with before they can go to bed." Churchill, he continued, often assumed that agreed proposals were due to the malevolent intrigues of socialist ministers who have beguiled their weak Conservative colleagues. This suggestion is unjust and insulting to ministers of both parties.
Attlee knew that Churchill, or at least the part of Churchill that listened to Brendan Bracken and Lord Beaverbrook, believed that he was surrounded by clever, scheming socialists, intent on using their position in his government to introduce revolutionary change behind his back. When Beaverbrook and Bracken state their opinions, Attlee wrote to Churchill, "It is obvious that they do not know anything about it. Nevertheless, an hour is consumed in listening to their opinions." And so the memorandum went on, unemotional, precise, and merciless. Churchill's private secretary, Sir John Colville, said that the Prime Minister was thunderstruck, dictated a lengthy and furious reply, but withdrew it after his wife told him, "I admire Mr. Attlee for having the courage to say what everyone is thinking." So instead he wrote a terse note. "I have to thank you for your private and personal letter of January 19. You may be sure I shall always endeavour to profit by your counsels."
In the first few months of 1945, we see Attlee travelling around much of liberated Europe, inquiring into relief questions and looking at the damage. The end of war was in sight, but as long as the war with Japan was ongoing, both Attlee and Churchill had wanted to keep the coalition going. It was to prove impossible. On May the 11th, 4 days after Germany's surrender, and on the eve of Labour's annual conference, its national executive met in Blackpool, Herbert Morrison, now chairman of the party's campaign committee, put up a strong case for going to the country at once. The mood for change was now and should be grasped. The NEC agreed, and Attlee at once wrote to Churchill that Labour would stay in the coalition only until October. Churchill chose to go to the country at once, fixing the general election for the 5th of July. He said in a radio broadcast,
"No socialist government conducting the entire life and industry of this country could afford to allow sharp, free, or violently worded expressions of public discontent. They would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo. no doubt very humanely directed in the first instance, and this would rip opinion in the bud. It would stop criticism as it reared its head, and it would gather all the power to the Supreme Party and the party leaders.
Another Labour leader might have angrily denounced the dishonesty. Attlee did something unusual, imaginative and brave. His broadcast the next day began, "When I listened to the Prime Minister's speech last night, I realised at once what was his object. He wanted the electors to understand how great was the difference between Winston Churchill, the great leader in war of a united nation, and Mr. Churchill, the party leader of the Conservatives. He paid generous tribute to the Conservatives and Liberals, Labour's partners in the wartime coalition, and to our great leader in war, the Prime Minister, who feared lest those who accepted his leadership in war might be tempted out of gratitude to follow him further. I thank him for having disillusioned them so thoroughly." The voice we heard last night was that of Mr. Churchill, but the mind was that of Lord Beaverbrook. He had politely thrown Churchill's bomb back in the Prime Minister's face, where it helped to destroy its creator. And he then outlined the difference between the parties. The Conservative Party believes that the basis of our economic activities must be what they call private enterprise, inspired by the motive of private profit. They seem to hold that if every individual pursues his own interests, somehow or other the interest of all will be served. The country has been run on this principle for years. Yet a great number of people in this country have always been badly housed, badly clothed, deprived of the opportunity of work. The Labour Party believes that if you want certain results, you must plan to procure them. In peace, as in war, the public interest must come first. We need well-planned, well-built cities and parks and playing fields, homes and schools, factories and shops. We do not want our beautiful country destroyed by haphazard development, dictated only by profit. We must have no more distressed areas. There was a time when employers were free to employ little children 16 hours a day. I remember when employers were free to work sweated women finishing trousers at a penny a pair. It was freedom for the rich at the expense of the poor.
The idea that this might be a landmark election which would change the face of Britain seems not to have occurred to most of the pundits. Manchester Guardian wrote, "This is not the election that is going to shake Tory England." The News Chronicle, faced with a Gallup poll giving Labour a 6-point lead, find it so hard to credit that they ran the story as a low-key single-column one full of caveats. It was a landslide. Labour was returned with 393 seats, the Conservatives had 213, the Liberals 12. With 2 communists, 1 Commonwealth Party and 19 others, Labour had an overall majority of 146, its first ever overall parliamentary majority. Attlee reported that Churchill would go to Buckingham Palace at 7 p.m. to resign and advise the King to send for him. Herbert Morrison said that he must not accept an invitation from the King to form a government. Morrison claimed, wrongly, that the rules of the Parliamentary Labour Party required Labour MPs now to elect a leader. If Attlee tried to form a government, Morrison, he said, could not undertake to join it. This was a clear threat to destroy the party. Attlee said nothing, but he knew where he stood. He wrote in an unpublished fragment of autobiography, "Morrison had some idea that he ought to be Prime Minister in my place. The idea was fantastic and certainly out of harmony with the feeling of the party." His published autobiography makes no mention at all of the incident. As they argued, Morrison was called out to take a telephone call. While he was out, Ernest Bevin said, "Clem, you go to Buckingham Palace straight away." Morrison returned. Attlee told his wife, Vi, nothing except that they must now go to Buckingham Palace to keep his 7:30 appointment with the King.
At the palace, Vi, with that instinctive humility which both of them possessed, waited outside in the Hillman, just as Churchill's chauffeur had waited outside in the Rolls-Royce half an hour before. But I was later invited to wait inside when it was discovered that I was Mrs. Attlee, she wrote in a private diary. Attlee, meanwhile, was ushered into George VI's presence. These two painfully shy, understated men looked at each other, and Attlee said, "I've won the election." The King replied, "I know. I heard it on the 6 o'clock news. You look more surprised than I feel, the King added in a friendly way, but he was finding his new chief minister heavy going. I gather they call the new Prime Minister Clem, the King said afterwards to his private secretary, Alan Lascelles. Clam would be more appropriate. The shy schoolboy, who turned a bright shade of purple at the slightest embarrassment, was now a man of 62, with a stronger inner certainty than any of the superficially more confident men around him. The shyness had not gone away. It had been harnessed and put to work. Attlee told his new MPs not to feel affronted if he failed to greet them when he met them in the corridors. It's only because I'm shy. And what is also true of Attlee is that he behaved modestly. Soon after the election, he insisted on travelling from Westminster to his constituency by train and bus. He boarded a bus and started rooting in his pocket for the fare, as he had done dozens of times before. By the time the bus got to the East End, it was overrun by photographers clambering over the seats, and in Stepney, the police begged him to send for an official car for his journeys to and from Downing Street. He agreed reluctantly, protesting that he could not justify taking his official car when petrol was rationed. At first, before the Attlees moved into Downing Street, he carried on taking the train home to Stanmore, travelling by himself, a detective following discreetly a few paces behind just in case. And generally, he went unrecognised. He had to change a Baker Street, where a woman once approached him and said, "Have you ever been told you look just like Mr. Attlee?" "Frequently," he replied, and boarded his train.
The Lend-Lease Act, US aid to Britain during the war, had been offered for the duration of the war. And the war was over, but no one had foreseen what was to come, that the Americans would withdraw it abruptly. It was a devastating blow, leaving Britain in what the Chancellor, Hugh Dalton, called an almost desperate plight. The stark truth was that Britain must have a loan, and there was only one place it could come from, the USA. Keynes was sent to Washington to negotiate it. Attlee wrote to Tom the previous year, "Have I told you the present slogan of the city? Bankers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your canes." It was going to be very difficult. Keynes found a US government under heavy pressure to withdraw from Europe and not to appear to subsidise socialism in Britain. If there was to be a loan at all, the terms would be very tough, and there would be implied conditions which would make Britain subordinate to the USA on foreign affairs. While Keynes was negotiating, the US Secretary of State James Burns presented Ernest Bevin with a list of places around the world where the Americans would like to have bases, with the clear expectation that Bevin would support him in obtaining them. Thus, Britain's financial problems merged with its foreign policy, and the two have remained in unholy alliance ever since. The relationship was further strained after Truman authorised the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan, which seemed to Attlee to make his central foreign policy objective and international authority far more urgent. He was shocked by the reports he received of its horrific effects, shocked that Truman had used it without consulting Britain, and shocked that atomic secrets had not been shared with Britain as the wartime agreement stipulated. He at once fired off a telegram to Truman. "There is widespread anxiety as to whether the new power will be used to serve or to destroy civilization. I consider, therefore, that you and I, as head of the governments which have control of this great force, should without delay make a joint declaration of our intention to utilize the existence, not to utilize the existence of this great power, not for our own ends, but as trustees for humanity in the interests of all people, in order to promote peace and justice in the world."
While in Washington, Attlee tried to help Keynes by allaying the suspicion of the American people that the loan was going to help finance socialism. He told a joint session of Congress, "There is and always will be scope for enterprise. But when big business gets too powerful, so that it becomes monopolistic, we hold it is not safe to leave it in private hands. Further, in the world today, we believe, as do most people in Britain, that we must plan the economic activities of the country if we are to assure the common man of a fair deal. What a good speech you made in Congress, Vi wrote to him. It was one of the many long, loving, untidy, unself-conscious letters she always wrote when he was away. They then had to watch for months, while Truman battled to persuade the Congress to agree the loan, even on harsh terms. Attlee, Dalton and Bevan had to bite their tongues as they were depicted day after day in Congress and in the American press as sponging socialists crawling to Uncle Sam so that they could featherbed their people.
And yet, what the newly elected Labour government did was to mount a serious assault on Beveridge's 5 giants: want, disease, ignorance, squalor and idleness, and to narrow the enormous gap between the very rich and the very poor. The main instrument was the welfare state. Beveridge had designed the building. Attlee and his ministers set themselves the task of erecting it to a deadline of 5th July 1948. On that date, the 5 giants were to be buried. It was the work he had dreamed of being able to do ever since he published The Social Worker in the early 1920s. The National Health Service came into being, bang on schedule, on 5th July 1948, instantly becoming the world's biggest employer after the Red Army in the Soviet Union and the Indian National Railways.
The same day saw the introduction of Jim Griffith's social security measures and free school meals. By that day, 3/4 of the population had signed up with doctors under the NHS scheme. By September, the figure was 93%. 9 out of 10 GPs participated from the start. Attlee was the last person ever to show his feelings or talk about them, but it was probably one of the proudest days of his life. In the broadcast he made the previous day, his voice sounds, if not ecstatic, it would not have had the tempo to express ecstasy, and deeply contented. Tomorrow there will come into operation the most comprehensive system of social security ever introduced into any country. When I first went to work in East London, apart from what was done by voluntary organisations and by private charities, the only provision for the citizen unable to work through sickness, unemployment or old age was that given by the Poor Law. The Poor Law was designed to be, and indeed it was, the last refuge of the destitute. 4 acts, he said, were to come into force: the National Insurances Act, the Industrial Injuries Act, the National Assistance Act, and the NHS Act. They were all based on a new principle, that we must combine together to meet contingencies with which we cannot cope as individual citizens. They were part of a general plan, and they fit in with each other. They are comprehensive and available to every citizen. They give security to all members of the family. The NHS gives a complete cover for health by pooling the nation's resources and paying the bill collectively.
Bit by bit, the housing programme grew. 55,400 completions in 1946 and 139,690 in 1947. Where are all the people I need for my housing programme? Nye Bevan once rhetorically asked the Cabinet. Looking for houses, Nye, answered the Prime Minister. Hugh Dalton swiftly accomplished the first and easiest nationalisation, that of the Bank of England. Civil aviation followed, and the same year saw the nationalisation of cable and wireless communications and of the mines. Parts of civil aviation, gas, electricity and telecommunications were already publicly owned at the end of the war, but had the Conservatives been elected, they'd probably have returned them to private hands. In 1947, the government nationalised inland transport, railways, canals and road haulage, and the great utilities, electricity and gas. Iron and steel were not nationalised until 1949. This was the most fiercely opposed nationalisation of the lot, and Attlee and Morrison laboured to produce a compromise plan, but the demand for full nationalisation among Labour MPs and in the Cabinet was very strong.
Bevan has been attacked for failing to cost the NHS in the long term with any accuracy. The figures in his plan, as he freely admitted, were little more than educated guesses, and they proved optimistic. Was all this not the grossest sort of complacency, saddling the nation with such liabilities? Attlee gave his answer to the House of Commons in 1946. The question is asked, can we afford it? Supposing the answer is no, what does that mean? It really means that the sum total of the goods produced and the services rendered by the people of this country is not sufficient to provide for all our people at all times, in sickness, in health, in youth, and in age, the very modest standard of life that is represented by the sums of money set out in the second schedule to this National Insurance Bill. I cannot believe that our national productivity is so slow, that our willingness to work is so feeble, or that we can submit to the world that the masses of our people must be condemned to penury. It is, of course, all a matter of priorities. You cannot have a universal welfare state and low taxes. And the voters knew that in 1945 because Attlee and his ministers told them so. Governments since then have tended to blur this harsh truth.
Far from being a passenger in the government he ran, Attlee had been its guiding intellect and its engine room, more firmly in charge than most prime ministers. If the Conservatives had won the 1945 election, the revolution would not have happened. If Labour under a different leader had won, less would have been done. And it really was a revolution. Peter Hennessy writes, "The transformation in life chances for those at the bottom of the heap was quite dramatic." In York in 1936, 31% of households lived in poverty. In 1950, the figure was under 3%.
All this was achieved in the teeth of press opposition. James Margach, a lobby correspondent from the 40s to the 70s, was to say, "I've never known the press so consistently and irresponsibly political, slanted and prejudiced as during the years of Attlee's government." The Prime Minister himself was a figure of fun in the press throughout his 6 years in office. If it did not upset him, it upset his colleagues. Herbert Morrison's day began with the press cuttings, and he always wrote or telephoned if he did not like what he saw. As early as 1946, the Attorney General, Sir Hartley Shawcross, was attacking the campaign of calumny and misrepresentation which the Tory party and the Tory stooge press had directed at the Labour government. Freedom of the press does not mean freedom to tell lies. In October 1946, Parliament set up a royal commission on the press, which eventually forced the Press Council on the industry.
There had to be an election by the summer of 1950 at the latest, and it was fixed for February 1950. This time, Attlee and Vi travelled 1,000 miles in comparative style. The family Hillman have been traded in for a Humber, but not a new one. Attlee's speeches have not changed. The trade union leader Jack Jones said, "If you listen closely, his message was clear, forthright, honest, dignified, and essentially humane." Churchill's speeches seemed restrained by his standards. It was almost as though the old master feared his oratory would sound windy beside the clipped sentences of the Prime Minister.
"Are we," he asked in the broadcast, "to take another plunge into socialist regulation? Or shall we return to the high road of freedom, of enterprise, and with proper regulation, opportunity for all?"
Nonetheless, Labour achieved the highest popular vote any party had ever polled, even more than in 1945, and nearly 3% more than the Conservatives. The result was Labour 315, Conservatives 298, Liberals 9, Irish Nationalists 2. The Parliament, which lasted from February 1950 to October 1951, was a miserable one for Attlee. It saw the Korean War, the death of his closest colleague and political friend Ernest Bevin, and the political explosion that blew his party apart. On the 25th of June 1950, North Korean forces entered South Korea. 2 days later, President Truman ordered in US forces, and the United Nations Security Council called for the withdrawal of North Korean forces. British forces were sent to help, but privately, Attlee was restraining Truman from doing things which might spread the conflict, such as flying reconnaissance missions over Soviet territory. The British arms budget was increased massively, with, as David Reynolds puts it, disastrous economic and electoral consequences. And conscription was raised from 18 months to 2 years, imposing an enormous extra strain on the economy.
The spark which turned the smouldering embers in the party into a destructive bushfire was Gaitskill's determination to charge NHS patients half the cost of false teeth and spectacles in his first budget. Nye Bevan was now Labour Minister, and Gateskill had prepared the ground carefully, lining up his allies for an assault on the heart of Nye Bevan's old territory. In a sentence, we proposed to reduce the hospital estimates by £10 million and to find the balance of £20 million by what seems to us the only practical method, viz. The introduction of charges. On the 9th of April 1951, with a new government 2 months old and Bevan and Gateskill firmly in their trenches, Morrison chaired a cabinet meeting in Attlee's absence since Attlee was laid up in hospital. Gateskill presented the budget he was to deliver the next day. Morrison reported that the Prime Minister thought it would be stark folly to split and precipitate another general election. It would put the Tories in power for 10 years and people would blame Bevan. He added, how accurately we cannot know, that Attlee believed that they must stand by their Chancellor. The Cabinet backed Gateskill. The wounds of 1951 are still raw today. To his dying day, Michael Foot never forgave Attlee for not giving Bevan support against Gateskill. Dennis Healey has never forgiven him for not giving Gateskill full support against Bevan. Nye should have been given more time. Morrison and Gateskill should not have dug in, Attlee told Kenneth Harris. He advised Labour MPs, keep this here at Westminster. Do not take it into the constituencies. But it was not practical advice. Everywhere they went, Labour activists only wanted to know about one subject, the Great Split.
One day in June 1951, when nothing seemed to be going right, Attlee found a poem in his basket of work sent in by 15-year-old Anne Glossop of Penrose College, Colwyn Bay. One of the private secretaries must have thought it might amuse the Prime Minister and put it in his special box. The poem went, "Would you please explain, dear Clement, just why it has to be that certificates of education are barred to such as me? I've worked through 13 papers, but my swot is all in vain, because at this time next year I must do them all again. Please have pity, Clement, and tell the others too. Remove the silly age limit. It wasn't there for you." Attlee composed his reply. It was sent to Anne Glossop with secret typed on top of it, and has lain in Attlee's daughter-in-law's filing cabinet ever since. "I received with real pleasure your verses, my dear Anne. Although I've not much leisure, I'll reply as best I can. I've not the least idea why they have this curious rule, condemning you to sit and sigh another year at school. You'll understand that my excuse for lack of detailed knowledge is that school certs were not in use when I attended college. George Tomlinson is ill, but I have asked him to explain, and when I get the reason why, I'll write to you again."
Attlee announced an October election, and the result was the most unfair in recent political history and offers a serious indictment of our electoral system. Labour received more votes than the Conservatives, but fewer seats. It therefore lost the election, and the Conservatives had an overall parliamentary majority. Attlee once again increased Labour's vote, receiving 48.8% of the popular vote against 48% for the Conservatives. But once again, thousands of working class votes piled up in already strong traditional Labour seats. Attlee went on the radio. "Our defeat is not due to any falling away of Labour support, but to the fact that in most constituencies Liberals voted Tory, not Labour." Through the quiet, calm delivery, you can just about hear the disappointment in his voice.
For the first time since 1940, 11 years, Attlee had no responsibility for conducting the nation's affairs. He seems to have felt something like relief. He and his top ministers were exhausted. Vi was disappointed for her husband, but for herself, she was looking forward to living in Cherry Cottage, into which she now tried to cram Attlee's 2,000 books. "I know what I'm like. I don't know what would have become of me if I hadn't been married to the best man in the world."
Clem's sister, Mary, the missionary who was 8 years his senior, wrote,
"These 6 years have been to all your brothers and sisters a time of unsullied pride and gladness in you."
It was time to retire. Attlee wanted to be out of harness as soon as the election was over, but the shadow cabinet and Labour MPs urged him to stay. Bevan was the most fervent in this plea, for Attlee to stay, not just until an agreed date, but indefinitely. Bevan believed that if Attlee went now, his successor would probably be Herbert Morrison. Attlee held on because he wanted to hand the Labour Party on in good order. Attlee, whose views on most issues were noticeably to the left of Morrison's, thought that losing the left would mean ditching the radical dynamism which alone made the party worth supporting. He had reluctantly given up the idea that he could be succeeded by Aneurin Bevan. He never declared his wish at the time, but in later years there were hints that that was his preferred option. He terribly wanted Bevan to succeed him as leader, his friend Patricia Peck told me. He was very disappointed about that. Attlee was able to pass on to Gaitskell a relatively united party, and while the Bevanite group broke up, Gaitskell and Bevan worked together. Attlee thought the best choice had been made, but it never gave him pleasure. He went to Gaitskell's New Year party in Hampstead after the election, and calling for silence, raised his glass in a toast to the new Labour leader. Gaitskell rushed in from the next room where he had been serving drinks, saying, "Oh, Clem, thank you, I never expected this." And Attlee muttered under his breath, "And you've no right to." He said it just loud enough to be heard by Edna Healy, Dennis Healy's wife, who was standing beside him. One of the pleasures of writing biography is that you get to hear the person you are writing about. Everybody says Clement Attlee was terribly, never said very much. Somebody said he never used one word where none would do. And it's all very well hearing that. But I spent some time, if I'm writing a biography, in the National Sound Archives, just listening to what they sound like. And there was an interview that he did just after retirement. I think it was with Malcolm Muggeridge. And sat down, Malcolm Muggeridge began. He said, "Don't you feel, Lord Attlee, don't you feel socialism?" It was a long, long question. I mean, sort of, it was a Jim Nocte kind of question. Went on and on and on. And ending up by saying, "Don't you feel, Lord Attlee, that socialism really is, in the end, the same as Machiavellianism?" And Attlee said, "No."
Political life for Attlee was not at an end. He was a dedicated contributor to House of Lords business. By would drive him to Great Missenden Station, and he travelled in a third-class compartment to Baker Street and then on the Underground to Westminster. He was active in the movement for world government and seems to have had no sense whatsoever of his own importance. The LSE's Social Administration Department, where he'd once taught, sent round a standing invitation to all of its former staff to celebrate its 50th anniversary. The organisers thought that the early staff members had died, but just as the platform was settling down in the Shaw Library, someone noticed a small, elderly man arriving inconspicuously and taking a seat at the back. One of the platform party ran to the back in embarrassment to apologise and tried to persuade him to come up to the front. He refused, or rather demurred. The audience, as he was recognised, rose to its feet and applauded. Only then would he join the platform. Afterwards, they asked when his car was coming. No car came from King's Cross on the 68 bus. Very reliable route.
In June 1964 came bad news. Vi collapsed with a cerebral hemorrhage in the kitchen of the bungalow while cooking Sunday lunch at the age of 68. She was taken to hospital but died during the night. It was a shattering blow. They had been in love with each other without a pause from the day they met. He had not for a moment imagined that she might die before him. Felicity, Martin and Alison rushed to the bungalow and found their father, on the surface calm. He'd burnt the huge pile of letters he had written to his wife over the years. He never explained why, but we may suppose that they were for her, and that if he left them behind in future years, strangers would trawl all over them.
And I would have done too. In the midst of all this came the 1964 general election. Attlee was delighted with Harold Wilson's performance. "I had a good talk with HW yesterday and found him in great form," he wrote to Janet. He says that the reports from the constituencies are most encouraging, a 45 feeling. He took to the road himself. offering his simple, sharply focused message, the distilled wisdom of his political life at dozens of meetings. The difference between the two parties, he told his audiences, was that the Conservatives were only interested in profit, while Labour wanted to serve the community. Labour won with a majority of 4, and among Wilson's first guests for a weekend at Chequers was Attlee.
At the time of the 1951 Labour election defeat, Attlee's sister Margaret had written to Tom, lamenting the result. Tom wrote to her, "I don't think we should be too disconcerted by the result of the general election. Don't you think that after a revolution, such as been worked in the last 6.5 years, there is bound to be a reaction? The benefits of the revolution are taken for granted. The implications of the working out of its imperfections is taken to heart. As far as Clem is concerned, his work is safe. A bit of the backbone of history. Looking back to our old Christian social union days, did we ever dare to hope that we should get right into the promised land in our lifetime? That it should have been done with Clem as Prime Minister makes me give thanks every time I think of it." It indicated that Tom understood, whether Clem did or not, the revolutionary nature of the Attlee government.
Clement Attlee died on the 8th of October 1967. There was no state funeral. His ashes lie in Westminster Abbey with the inscription, Clement Attlee, 1883 to 1967. Prime Minister, 1945 to 1951. For 20 years, leader of the Labour Party. Attlee once described how he felt about death. "By the time I die, people will say, 'That old man only just dead? I thought he died ages ago.' I shan't mind. I recall what one of my good comrades in the war said. Anyway, I've lived in the greatest country in the world for 22 years. I have had 60 more than that. 60 more years of memories, of friendships and kindness." I shall die, with lots of poetry in my heart and perhaps on my lips.
In 2004, the largest and most systematic attempt at ranking the effectiveness of British Prime Ministers occurred in 2004 with the Mori University of Leeds survey of 139 British political scientists and historians. Attlee was ranked at the top as Britain's greatest Prime Minister of the 20th century.
Thank you, all of you. I get very moved by this. Thank you, Francis, Adjoa, Richard, Kika, Jeremy. A huge, huge thanks to Olivier and Christine here at Sands Film. Where are you? You disappeared. You absolutely made this possible. You are incredibly special people, thank you. We had a very small little team of helpers making this weekend happen. We had a fabulous weekend of films and talks and finishing here now. So thank you to all those people that have helped me make this weekend happen, helpers, film, photography. This is the first of our Attlee Nation project. It's just started this weekend. We're going to continue, so hopefully we'll see you all again at some point in the future. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.